Hello, I'm Richard Gigline. I'd like to welcome you to the latest in our Compensation Committee webcast series titled Calibrate Risk and Reward to Fit Your Unique Business Situation. Corporate boards today are clearly very attuned to the issue of pay for performance, which is a major focus of proxy advisory firms when they analyze executive pay programs for say-on-pay shareholder votes. Many companies concerned about gaining a positive voting recommendation have tended to default to adopting the most prevalent and therefore seemingly safe executive pay practices in the marketplace. Unfortunately, relying on generic incentive pay designs isn't an effective way to focus your executive team on your company's specific strategic priorities and goals. One reason is that copycat plans, by their nature, don't pay much attention to determining the right risk and reward profile. Yet determining the most appropriate balance between the level of risk and rewards in a performance-based program is an essential component of linking executive pay to meaningful long-term corporate value. In today's webcast, we'll discuss how focusing on achieving a better balance between risk and reward can help companies strengthen the link between executive compensation and their unique business needs. I'm pleased to be joined today by David Bixby and Wes Hart from the Houston office of Executive Compensation Consultancy, Meyer and Partners. Before we begin, I want to introduce Ronell Perry of NACD Education team, who will cover a few housekeeping points for us.
Thank you for joining us. If you look below, you can ask a question to our speakers, and they will submit a response to you either during or after the webcast. Also, please see the buttons below for additional resources. You can click the download presentation button below for a copy of the slides. The presentation will also be available at pearlmeyer.com/calibrating risk and reward. This webinar is good for one skill-specific credit. You will automatically receive one NACD credit for your participation. You can contact fellowships at nacdonline.org if you have any questions. A replay of the slides will be available early next week on our website and at pearlmeyer.com. Richard, back to you.
Well, we're now ready to move forward with the presentation, and I believe David is going to start it off.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Richard. And thank you to everyone for joining us on today's webinar. Wes and I value your time, and we hope to provide you some useful information and insights in return. Today we're going to discuss the topic of calibrating risk and reward to your specific unique business needs through what we're going to refer to as levers available to you in your incentive plans. Before we get started, why is this important? Why spend an hour talking about customizing incentive programs to your unique needs? Isn't there already a menu out there of generally accepted best practices? Shouldn't we just check that menu and see what the peers are doing and follow that model? Well, if you've passed your say-on-pay vote with flying colors more than once, you may consider this a previously solved equation. Perhaps. Or maybe you passed with flying colors because your program is already well calibrated, and shareholder support of your program is simply the result of strong performance driven by those well-calibrated incentives. And if so, congratulations. In our experience, however, even the best calibrated programs require constant maintenance, care, and feeding to keep that edge, and even the best-run companies have one or two things they think they can improve on in order to make sure their pay program continues to drive the types of behaviors and performance needed to align with their business strategy. External references like proxy advisor guidelines, which keep moving every year, by the way, and peer group practices are important inputs to this process and may even help define the fair way within which you want to operate. However, your unique business situation and talent needs should serve as your guideposts for program design so that you can be sure to build, maintain, and properly motivate the kind of truly great management team that you need to drive the long-term success of your organization. Companies work very hard to differentiate themselves from their competition in terms of their business strategy and in terms of the talent that they are able to attract to develop and drive that strategy. They carefully cultivate brand identity, invest in new technologies and products, and refine processes in an effort to set themselves apart. If you get caught up in having your pay program look like everyone else, racing to the middle of the fairway, you run the risk of losing the valuable connection between your pay program and your unique talent needs and business goals, and you risk producing results that fall far short of your expectations. Let's move on to the next slide. Before we go any further, let's do a little basic blocking and tackling. And when we're talking about balancing risk and reward in incentive programs today, what do we mean by risk? The business risks come in a variety of forms, including strategic, financial, operational, compliance-related, and reputational. Compensation risk, or the risk that compensation program design will encourage excessive risk-taking that may lead to problems in any of these areas, became an area of significant concern for compensation committees following the 2008 financial crisis. The choices of incentive measures and the overall mix of pay are both examples of program design considerations that can be used to mitigate against excessive or detrimental compensation-related or compensation-driven risk-taking. There are also a variety of governance controls that can be put in place, such as stock ownership guidelines, compensation clawbacks, mandatory incentive deferrals, or hedging prohibitions. I imagine you are all familiar with many of these controls. Wes and I are. They are regular topics of conversation in compensation committee meetings that we attend. For us today, however, the focus is on fine-tuning the balance between the components of risk we've defined on the slide. Pay at risk, or pay risk, that is the risk regarding the potential for not earning any value from a particular component of pay on the employee's part. Retention risk, a risk that I think is undervalued frequently by third-party observers, that talent is going to walk out the door. And performance risk, the risk for the company and for shareholders that the value realized from the program is not going to be reflective of the performance received. So let's move on to the next slide, and Wes is going to have a few things to say.
Sure, David, thanks. When we say getting the balance right, we don't mean striving for the middle of the practices and prevalence fairway, but rather we mean avoiding extremes where you have too much complexity, too much pay at risk, or too little pay at risk, and balancing the plan against your unique business situation. At the extremes, overly aggressive incentive compensation can encourage short-term decisions that are detrimental to long-term success, while putting too little pay at risk, in contrast, can lead to a culture where everything is an entitlement, and you create what we call a pay-for-pulse culture. Years ago, I was brought into an engagement with a small company where the top two executives were paid very, very well. They had guaranteed bonuses prior to us getting there, guaranteed long-term incentive grants, but not surprisingly, they were the absolute worst performing company in their space, in their peer group. So I think the answer there is too many entitlements can lead toward lagging performance. So the key is getting the balance right, and that requires companies to understand the potential design parameters or levers, as Dave and I will be calling them in this presentation today, and be willing to apply critical levers in a manner that builds and maintains your leadership talent while driving long-term success by measuring and rewarding performance that drives overall success as is uniquely defined at your company, and timing rewards to match your actual business cycle. Even if the timing is shorter or longer than typical award cycles, as we will describe today, too few companies make meaningful deviations from the standard 3-year long-term performance investing cycles. Moving on to the next slide, we've got a chart here that demonstrates some of the extreme choices and outcomes and shows how important it is to get the balance right. Clearly, every company wants to be winning. As David and I have noted, companies that spend seemingly customizing business plans, putting together best-in-class senior leadership teams can truly ruin everything with a poorly conceived or poorly executed incentive program. With too little incentive, you run the risk of paying too much for performance that lags the overall market or your specific industry group. With too much pay at risk in the program, such as very low fixed pay and hyper-aggressive incentive compensation, you run the risk of driving ill-advised short-term decisions that result in long-term catastrophe. We've got enough problems in the world already without having to suffer through the ramifications of bad compensation choices. Even though it can create work for compensation consultants that come in afterwards to fix the mess that's been created, we'd rather see companies get it right the first time. You don't want to wait until you lose your key talent before realizing your comp programs are not the best they could be, or until you go meaningfully off from your business plans. On the next screen, we have the first of our 3 polling questions for today. Please select the answer that best fits your organization or your experience. What factor is given the most weight in determining the design of incentive compensation plans at your company? Peer group prevalence, proxy advisory firm guidelines, generally accepted practices, company-specific factors, or some other thing entirely?
If I had to guess here, I'm going to guess that we'll see 1 be most common, but 2 and 3 are certainly rapidly gaining, and hopefully we'll see 4 catch up. I know that that's been my experience, that the focus, and I think at times we've been guilty of it as well, underscoring that focus on peer group prevalence and competitive practice, particularly with the advent of say on pay.
Yeah.
But I think it's important that we focus as much as we can on number 4 here on the list.
Let's move to the results of the poll now.
Great, Richard.
Well, that's refreshing. We've got a well-evolved group here on the phone today. So we've got a lot of, most of the participants who actually are primarily focusing on company-specific factors in the design of their incentive programs.
Yeah, it's great to see. It's great to see. We expect 1 to be prevalent, but it's great to see a lot of companies are already using some customization in their programs.
I'm particularly satisfied by number 2 as well. So let's move on to the next slide. So let's step back for a second again and think about where we are. We're going to start walking through some steps that we would suggest going through in order to tie your levers in your incentive plan to your specific business needs. But as an organization, so you've expended significant time and energy and board strategy retreats on developing a customized business strategy to drive long-term value creation. It's a value creation that's going to exceed business as usual and beat your competition who, by the way, are working on their own customized business strategies. You also spent time identifying, acquiring, and developing the type of leadership talent you need to make that business strategy a reality. So how do you go about mindfully designing a pay program that aligns compensation with your business strategy and with the corresponding leadership development needs? All too often, we find at this stage that companies default to a one-size-fits-all approach, discounting the value of their own good judgment and allowing someone else, proxy advisory firm, activist shareholder, academia, or peer group practice, to dictate the parameters of their program. Truly effective pay program design is characterized by careful customization of program elements, metrics, and mix in support of your key organizational objectives. Now, assuming you've already gotten reasonably comfortable with the answer to how much, that is, where do you want to position yourself on a total compensation basis relative to the competitive market, the next step, or the first step in the how of program design, how to design a program that is a good fit for your organization, is then to determine the relative mix of pay components you want to provide. All of the pay components shown on the slide here you can find in fine CD&A sections everywhere, and they can all be valuable for attraction, retention, and differentiation to varying degrees. Although we believe that the variable incentive opportunities, short-term and long-term, hold the greatest promise for customizing your program to your business and talent priorities, and they are our focus in the remainder of this presentation. So let's move to the next slide. When you set about customizing the design of your incentive programs, you have multiple levers at your disposal in both your annual and your long-term incentive programs. Familiarity with these levers and their application is integral to getting the balance right. Now, on the slide here, we have some example levers that might apply to both your annual and your long-term plan, along with some typical trade-offs or considerations. Let's take a look at a few of these in a little bit more detail. Performance measures, for example. Let's think about picking the right ones for your company. Now, we've noted here that a typical trade-off might be between emphasizing financial performance or strategic milestones. Potentially an important trade-off for a company who's implementing a new strategic plan, which is dependent upon achievement of some specific near-term objectives that are not expected to result immediately in increased profitability. You may also want to think about whether you have the right financial measures in your plan. Common measures like EPS or total shareholder return in a long-term plan may be selected based upon competitive prevalence or external guidelines. But they're largely outcome measures that don't provide much insight into what's really driving profitable performance or long-term growth and shareholder value. And companies who are able to identify the true drivers of performance that underlie these outcome measures, cash flow, introduction of new product lines, improved safety performance, reduced turnover, diversification, and place specific weights on these measures in their incentive program, may find that they're able to drive improved results that are better aligned with their business strategy. As an example, I work with a company who has taken a lot of time, a lot of energy and resources in conducting strategic analysis about which financial measures and operational measures really drive the key performance measures that shareholders look at and then the market looks at to value their firm. And they have taken a rather unique approach to the design of their long-term incentive program, where rather than using one or two relative measures against a peer group, there's a relative performance overlay to the plan that is driven really by a basket of multiple measures, drivers that management has a direct line of sight to, that then are expected to drive long-term value creation. And the performance outcomes for this particular company over the last several years have placed them at the 90th or 100th percentile in terms of total shareholder return performance against their peer group for the last 1, 2, 3, 5-year periods. So they're a star performer in the industry, and I think that the care that they've taken in determining the performance measures that they want to have in their plan has been a key component to that. The difficulty is another topic that we often cover in compensation committee meetings, and the difficulty of the performance standards in the annual plan. Not just the level of target performance, but the range from threshold to maximum levels of performance in the plan as well. So, as an example, an issue Wes and I have both encountered before involves companies where management regularly establishes target performance in the annual incentive plan at a level 5 to 10% below their budget. So, for example, targeting EPS performance at 90% or 95% of their budget. The common concern here that we hear expressed from directors is that by setting the target at a level below budget, is management setting the bar too low? Don't most companies use budget as their target? Well, in our experience, yes, they do. But I think the correct question in this case is, how challenging is this particular budget? Is the budget an aspirational number, a best-case scenario established to try to stretch the organization? If that's the case, it may be appropriate to establish target payout that is 100% of the individual's target bonus opportunity at a level somewhere short of budget. Typically, we think about target as the level of performance that you would be able to reach at least 50 to 60% of the time. Of course, none of these levers can be considered in a vacuum. They're all connected to a certain extent. So when talking about difficulty, you want to make sure that the corresponding payout is properly calibrated as well. If you have target incentive opportunities that are established above the market median, perhaps the more challenging budget number in this case really is the right place to set target. And finally, another topic, another area on this slide or lever that commonly comes up in conversation is the use of discretion. It can be applied in the evaluation of individual performance, company performance, or in the determination of actual payouts. And it's almost always cast in a suspicious or outright negative light by proxy advisory firms. I was telling Wes before we got on today that every time I read an ISS or a Glass-Lewis report, they'll always mention when they find that discretion has been exercised somewhere in the plan, and you can almost see the analyst cocking an eyebrow and shaking their head as they write about discretion. However, I believe, and we believe, that the ability and willingness of the compensation committee to apply discretion, both positive and negative, is a key component of a well-run incentive program. The formulaic evaluation of performance and payout can help to set clear performance expectations for participants and enforce accountability to performing against pre-established targets. However, an entirely formulaic program that works perfectly every time without any unintended consequences is rare. Discretion in the determination of actual incentive plan payouts can help to address uncertainty in the market or complexity in determining the true level of performance where a formula simply doesn't capture the whole picture. An example might be a safety measure, where a formula based upon the number of reportable incidents in a given year would justify a maximum safety bonus, but where the severity of one of those incidents, or the presence of one or more near misses hiding behind the numbers, would argue for scaling the award back. And Wes, you actually have a client who has a rather unique way of evaluating safety performance that I think you really like. Could you tell us about it?
Sure, David. Yeah, safety is one of those qualitative measures that should often impact bonuses in certain industries, particularly industrials and things like that. Now, I've got a client with a very robust safety scorecard that results in an overall letter grade score, A, B, C, D, et cetera, where anything below a B results in a significant decrement or decrease in the bonus payouts. I think it's been real effective in driving what's really a priority to this company, improving the safety results and maintaining safety at a level that's reasonable for their industry.
And one of the things I liked about the scorecard actually was that it's composed of input and output measures. So you've got lead and lag measures in there, and you're trying to track behaviors on the front end, and then the sorts of measures that you can actually keep track of on the outcome side. And I think has a very powerful weighting of those two approaches to come to an answer that really makes sense for this company in particular. So next, we have the second of our three polling questions, this time on discretion, which remains prevalent, as we said, in annual incentive programs in particular, despite the pushback from proxy advisory firms. So please select the best answer regarding the level of discretion used at your firm. Is award determination largely or entirely discretionary? Is there an explicitly discretionary component that applies equally to all participants, that is, to company performance? Is there an individual or strategic goal component that includes a discretionary evaluation? Or is discretion used to just adjust individual awards up or down? Or is it simply not used very much at all in a largely formulaic plan?
And while we realize you may have more than one of these, we just want you to pick the best one. The idea here is there's a continuum between the top being totally discretionary and the bottom being no discretion at all. So we'd like to see where people fall on that spectrum. We tend to think companies could use discretion a little more than they typically do. That's one of those areas where we think pushback against the proxy advisors is highly warranted.
So let's take a look at the results. Interesting. Okay, so most companies are in the middle of that spectrum, but I would not quite have expected to see us drop off that much, moving from individual and strategic goal component to plans where there's an even larger component of discretion. So we're leaning more towards formulaic.
Right. And I think that's something people can improve upon and maybe tweak a little bit, add a little more discretion into their programs.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Moving on to the next slide now. The table on this slide shows the rest of what we're calling our incentive design levers. In this case, limited to those which apply largely or almost exclusively to long-term incentives. The choice of long-term incentive vehicles I'm going to talk about more on the next page, but focusing on the vesting approach here, typically there are two choices: ratable vesting or vesting in pieces over multiple years, which can sometimes enhance attraction or near-term retention value of an award, and cliff vesting, which can emphasize retention over a longer period of time where there's a set number of years before any of the award would vest at all. That's what cliff vesting typically is. More importantly, in an area where we think companies can move further off from just the typical normal peer practices, is the timing of awards. And by that I mean both the performance period and the vesting period. David and I encourage you to think beyond the typical 3-year norm for long-term programs. An issue in the timing of incentive designs is that both the business cycle and the payoff for key investors in many industries is longer than the standard 3-year performance period. Companies in those industries often address their executive retention needs by granting progressively larger 3-year long-term opportunities. That can keep your executives in their seats with money on the table, but we think a more effective approach, which is definitely a minority practice to consider, is if your particular business or investment cycle warrants it, set a longer-term performance period, something longer than 3 years, or lengthier vesting on top of a performance award to stretch it out even further to 4, 5, or 6 years, rather than the standard industry practice of the 3-year norm that we see everywhere. Setting these longer-term goals can be difficult, we realize, but necessary and rewarding. Committees will be stuck with short-term behaviors as long as they're stuck with short-term thinking and as long as they reward only for short-term performance. Stock ownership guidelines can discourage short-term thinking somewhat, but only temporarily in most cases, unless the value keeps ratcheting up, either with holding requirements or with extending the requirements even further, which is sometimes hard to do. We think a better solution to that, like I said, is having a longer period. Go on to the next slide now. As most of us are aware, there are 3 primary categories of long-term incentive vehicles in common U.S. practice: time-vested restricted stock, standard stock options, and performance awards, which can take the form of either cash or stock. Restricted stock provides the retention piece of typical long-term incentive awards as a lower-risk alternative, which encourages long-term share ownership and encourages people to stay in their seats. Standard stock options are a little more risky than restricted shares, clearly, in that they require positive stock price appreciation for any ultimate value to be realized. While significant gains over a typical 10-year term can provide meaningful reward opportunities and create a longer-term focus beyond the typical 3-year performance period, standard 10-year options are not popular with certain individuals, including Warren Buffett, he thinks they're a lottery ticket, and with proxy advisory firms who refuse to declare options as performance-based. Even with those negatives, many of our clients continue to view options as a powerful performance-based incentive. David, what are your clients saying about options these days?
I have a number of clients who continue to view stock options as a powerful and very important performance-based component of their compensation program. And I encourage them, and they do, continue to make the case to their shareholders whenever they can and in their proxy filing that these are performance-based awards. One of the things they particularly like about these awards is that they have the performance feature already built in. So they don't have to have a discussion about what the right 3-year or 5-year performance goal should be. It's ready to go off the shelf, and it also enhances long-term focus, because I think for executives who understand the true value of options, they realize that in order to actually get the value out of the option that the Black-Scholes valuation tells you should, you've got to hold that option for longer than a typical 3-year performance period. So executives who are holding options, particularly CEOs, will be holding those for much longer than 3 or 5, often all the way to the end of the 10-year period, in order to maximize that value. So it's a very powerful incentive.
Yeah, David, I totally agree with you. And I think sticking with our theme of customization and customizing plans to your purposes, one of the areas I think, again, that's underused is adjusting those standard option parameters or even adding performance hurdles to stock options in certain rare circumstances. With those sort of levers, you can create a customized LTI vehicle with the stock option that supports the company's specific strategic initiative and timing. For example, shortening the option term to 5 years avoids some of the perception that options will eventually pay off even with relatively low performance over a 10-year cycle. Or creating a performance hurdle where the options expire, for instance, if the stock price hasn't risen at the end of 3 or 4 years, will potentially allow options to be considered performance-based by the proxy advisors, and also it sort of wipes the books of underwater options without actually having any kind of a repricing event. I think so adding a hurdle in there, so if your stock option is underwater at the end of 3 or 4 years, it would expire unexercised. That's an inventive feature we haven't seen used a lot, but I think it has a place.
Yes, I agree, and I would say that one of the key reasons where companies, clients that we work with have gotten rid of options is that overhang issue, that they've had a history of having large buckets of options sitting out there contributing to their overhang. And if you added a feature like that in there, that potentially could address that issue and make stock options a viable choice for you again.
Right. And the third and last category of the overall long-term incentive vehicles is performance-based awards. Clearly, they've grown rapidly in prevalence over recent years, and in many cases, it's the most prevalent award of all nowadays, supplanting options and time-vested restricted stock in many cases. They can be the most risky of the 3 award types, with typical awards giving you only a single chance to realize any value. However, the downside risk is typically balanced by a significant upside, so if you beat the target, you'll get layered on or extra award. That sort of mitigates the risk of losing your award entirely. And you can really, if you get creative, you can create meaningful, controllable performance goals beyond just stock price appreciation. David and I have both seen numerous cases where companies have added performance-based awards, whether it's a return on capital type measure or economic profit measure or even strategic milestones in their long-term plans. And it really does drive a trajectory toward the company's ultimate goals. It's amazing what you can do if you create an incentive plan that's creative and focused enough on what you're trying to do as a company.
So let's move on to the next slide. So here's where the rubber meets the road. This table is intended to help tie things together, to provide a sense for how you could apply some of your available levers using some common, broadly applicable business situations and demonstrating how you might work forward from business strategy to talent strategy to incentive program design, as opposed to the approach of developing your business strategy, identifying talent priorities, and then defaulting to typical practice. So let's just look at a couple of examples. If you have an early-stage business model that's trying to do something completely new, strategy calls for recruitment of innovative talent, and your emphasis is likely to be on strategic milestones in the near term, introducing new product lines, for example, with the real payoff coming several years down the road, likely beyond the typical 3-year long-term performance window, applicable to an established company who's already hit their stride. Cash incentives in the near term can help reinforce the focus on those strategic objectives, but in the end, they're not the primary motivator, nor do you have a lot of cash to spend at this point. The longer-term payoff and the opportunity to be part of something really big is the primary motivation for the talent you're bringing in the door. And in this case, stock options feel to me like the right long-term incentive alternative, inherently performance-based and tied directly to growing the value of the company over a more substantial long-term period. And that is where I would put the emphasis when determining mix of pay. In contrast, you can consider a mature, capital-intensive industry with a well-defined peer group. There's little in the way of top-line growth. The total industry pie is fairly stable, and you're focused on increasing your slice and making that slice more profitable. Innovative thinking is nice, but mostly has impact at the margins. You're not trying to hit a home run that would make stock option awards particularly valuable. You're trying to hit singles and doubles and turn in consistently better performance. You're focused on retaining existing talent and growing that talent internally. Annual incentive opportunities may be fairly substantial, but the role of discretion in the determination of the payouts is limited likely, except perhaps in accounting for individual contribution or addressing key cultural imperatives. Long-term incentives are not as heavily weighted, relatively speaking, as in some higher growth industries. You might be using a balanced portfolio of time-based and performance-based long-term incentive compensation, which could include a return on capital measure against your peers. Or, if you don't have a large group of peers, maybe this is a case where you could use some direct absolute performance measures in that plan. So we also have a couple more mini case studies with some additional wrinkles that we'd like to walk through. Let's go to the next slide. Case study number 1 is an established company whose business model has become outdated and whose business has consequently begun to decline, eroding earnings and the company's market value. So the company has developed a strategic plan for turning things around, rebranding, improving efficiency, phasing out or disposing of non-core business lines, focusing investment on acquiring and developing expertise in non-traditional or high-growth areas. As part of that plan, there are some concrete near-term objectives that must be accomplished if the organization is to remain a going concern. Not everyone in the organization is critical to the success of this effort, but for those employees who are critical, the organization is exposed. Competitors are circling, ready to replace lost value with shiny new awards of equity and attractive signing bonuses. In this case, restricted stock can provide immediate, meaningful retention value, substantial enough to keep critical employees focused and to raise the bar further for potential talent poachers. Although a combination of restricted stock and cash retention awards may be necessary depending on share availability, and the vesting period that you apply to these awards may have some large interim or stepped vesting in order to put portions of the award a little bit closer to the participants and enhance that near-term retention by making the value more real. Near-term performance focus can also be enhanced through strategic milestones in the annual plan and through performance-based long-term incentives that have a 1 or 2 year performance period and can be earned based upon success over the intermediate term, followed by additional years of vesting to further enhance retention. Taking the carrot that you're trying to get to and carving off a piece and putting it a little bit closer, just to make it more achievable and to enhance motivation and buy-in to the new approach. So let's move on to the next slide, and Wes is going to walk us through another example.
Case study number 2 is a company facing radical changes to its business landscape brought on by new technology and changing customer preferences. Frankly, this is a very common situation nowadays, due to big companies and small companies alike. Key considerations in this case include not only a challenging short-term outlook, but also the potential for significant long-term growth with proper investment in the right technology. In this case, retention is less of a concern because the shifting landscape applies across the entire industry. It is not just an individual company situation. However, motivation becomes a big issue here because you want management to work extra hard, long hours. You want them to be especially creative in coming up with unique solutions for your situation, and you want them to think truly big. So potential levers in this case include expanding the range for acceptable performance in the annual plan, so there's a bigger range between, say, threshold and maximum to allow for all the possible outcomes. Also increasing the role of discretion in the plan so that if things happen that you didn't predict but that actually are quite exciting and good for the company, you can reward them appropriately. Secondarily, in a situation like this, when you want people to think big and think long, you need to move more of the pay from the short-term bucket into the long-term bucket. And within your long-term bucket, you may shift more of it away from time vested to performance vested. And it might make sense in this case to use some sort of relative, even a relative TSR measure or other relative measure against your peer group. So again, if you win by doing better than the peers, however it's measured in your situation, you'll get a lot more reward out of it. And keeping people focused sort of on the fight at hand to achieve what they're trying to achieve and win against the competitive market. Next, we'll have the last of our final polling questions. In this case, we're going to ask you to select all that apply, so maybe take a little more time on this one. Have you made any changes over the recent years intended to address a change in your business situation to your incentive plans? Have you changed performance measures in your annual or long-term incentive plan? Have you expanded or contracted acceptable performance range in the annual plan? Have you shifted the mix of long-term incentive awards? Have you shifted the overall mix of pay to more incentive compensation? Have you shifted the overall mix of pay to more fixed compensation? Or have you made other changes?
And I was noticing before we got on here that we left off the alternative of not having made any changes. So we're presuming that that everybody will have had to have made some changes over the last few years to their incentive plans to address the changing market. If I had to guess, I'd guess that shifting the mix of long-term incentive awards is going to be most common. But I think we'll see some high prevalence for a few of these. So let's take a look and see if we've got some results. And there we go.
Quite a bit of change. It looks like people have changed their measures, which we think, I mean, that's a very common, you need to look at that every year.
Yeah, that's
really
true.
Do.
I mean, even in an established situation, clients are constantly shifting a little bit here and there. To one of the points we made earlier, that even in very well-run companies, there are always little changes, little ways that you feel like you can better align that pay and performance link.
Yeah, the other interesting thing is very few of the companies have shifted to more fixed compensation.
Yeah, no, I think that was something we thought was going to happen right after the financial crisis, and I think a small subset of the economy moved more incentive pay into fixed pay. So that's interesting. All right, let's move on to the next slide, and thank you for participating in our polling, humoring us today. So once you have the right levers in place to address your unique business situation, you move into a mode, hopefully, where you're able to monitor and calibrate the levers to sustain the desired balance, unless and until, of course, your situation changes significantly. So you can use measures like realizable pay and performance, absolute and relative to peers, to help ensure that incentive plan outcomes are properly calibrated with the type of performance you've been turning in. You maintain consistency in communication and execution over several years. A misalignment, mixed messages, and constantly changing priorities can render carefully calibrated programs ineffective. And Wes and I have both worked with companies who have, for various reasons, made significant changes to their pay programs over multiple years. And by the time you get to the end of a 2 or 3 year period where you've changed significant pieces of the plan, you've lost the room. Most of your employees don't really have any expectation that there's anything consistent or expected in the plan. And then retention becomes a concern along with motivation and performance. You want to monitor outcomes to ensure that retention and succession planning aren't negatively impacted by poorly designed programs. You want to make sure you're keeping and developing the right people. Are you losing your star performers because your program isn't rewarding the behaviors and performance that you say you want? And then you can mitigate compensation-related risks with some common sense good governance, not just governance controls like stock ownership guidelines or clawbacks, but sound processes in the design and administration of your organization's compensation programs, including an engaged compensation committee and open, timely, and respectful communication between management, the committee, and the committee's outside pay advisors.
Next slide. So in conclusion, companies have powerful tools at their disposal in the form of incentive plan levers, as long as they understand both potential trade-offs and how these trade-offs relate to their unique situation. Just like a physician promises within the Hippocratic Oath to first do no harm, the compensation program, and particularly the incentive elements of it, should encourage no harmful behaviors, either through direct incentives such as writing bad loans to increase current bonuses, or through the lack of appropriate controls where you pay for failure or pay for all outcomes regardless of what happens. It's important that companies and their advisors focus less on peer practices and advisory firm guidelines in favor of a much greater emphasis on company-specific factors. In doing so, they must decide how best to address changes or the lack of changes in their specific business situation, their industry, and in some cases the overall economy, and maintain consistency and clarity of message to help foster a performance-driven culture that will deliver on desired outcomes. I think we've got a number of questions that have come up during the talk. We'll try to address some of those right now.
Before we move on to the questions, I'd like to have Ronell Perry of NACD Education Team go through a few additional compensation resources that will be of interest to our participants. Ronell?
Oh.
Thank you, Richard. We're proud to offer more from our compensation series with our partner Pearl Meyer and Partners. The next webinar that we will present will be the myths and realities of pay for performance alignment in 2014. It will be live on Thursday, August 7th from 2 to 3 p.m. Please register and view our archives at nacdonline.org/webinars. Richard?
Thanks, Ronell. Let's go to the questions now. We go to the first one. How do you feel about benchmarking performance against the market or an industry metric? Stock and stock options reward returns to the market as well as to the firm itself.
Well, I mean, peer group performance and market expectations, or returns to shareholders, are key inputs in whether you're using an output measure like total shareholder return, or whether you're trying to find the driver measures that are going to lead to that long-term growth. Those are important inputs to help validate whether the benchmarks that you're setting in your plan are reasonable. Is the amount of growth implied by your EPS goal, is it within the right range relative to what you've seen over the last 15 years? Are you projecting a level of growth in EPS implied by your target that just does not seem feasible based on what the peer group's been able to accomplish over that period? So I think it's a valuable input. I don't think it's the only input.
It's important to keep a mix of both relative and absolute measures and both lead and lagging measures. So classic example of a relative lagging measure is TSR, where after the fact we look at TSR versus the peer group, and a portion of the payout from the LTI would be based on that. But it's good to have a balance against some sort of absolute milestones or goals that have nothing to do with peers. Just you execute on your own plan. If you can combine those two things together, the peer comparison is the sanity check, and the other piece is really driving behaviors. And if you achieve on both of those, everybody wins.
And the audience says on this whole peer review thing, he says, I find the peer review process quite problematic. It has contributed to the escalation problem in pay that seems to move independently of performance. There is also some gaming with respect to the design of peers. For example, what industry is cable television in, or entertainment, or telecommunications, or high technology?
Right. I mean, this is a topic that comes up frequently. I mean, we go through a very rigorous process when we're trying to select peers, and I'm aware of cases, as you note, where it appears that companies are gaming the system, trying to pick high-paying peers, trying to remove companies who don't pay as richly in their programs, looking at oversized peer groups. That's a common one you run into, where your company is at the low end of the size range or maybe even outside the 25th to 75th percentile middle range. In my experience, that's not the norm. And I think the way that, when you think about peer group, I guess what we're talking about here is we're talking about a compensation peer group that you're using to drive the market number you're trying to hit in terms of overall value, as opposed to the performance peer group that you're using to assess performance outcomes in your annual or long-term plan. That compensation peer group can be more broadly defined than companies who are in your specific industry, because you're looking for places that you might likely compete for talent. Other companies that have a similar geographic scope, revenue size, talent needs, that might reasonably hire away your people, or that your people might consider to be a potential competitor for their services. The peer group numbers shouldn't be the only input to the process, but I don't know of a way to remove that competitive market from the equation, because the market finds a way to pay for talent, and I think compensation committees are ill-served if they don't at least look at what that market number is.
Right, and I think that over the last 10 years, or as we've gone through various cycles and things, I mean, virtually all of our clients at some level target the median. Back in the day, 20 years ago, companies might have targeted 75th percentile for all their elements of pay, and that's when you got the ratcheting back in time into the late 80s. I don't think companies do that any longer, but people primarily targeting the median, as long as you've got a reasonable peer group in terms of your size and your scale of operations, there shouldn't be a ratcheting effect of what you've chosen in peers. I don't think that's as big a problem as it used to be.
Yeah, I agree with that point as well.
Go ahead, Richard.
One of our participants in the audience would like to know, in addition to monetary incentives, how can elements such as non-competes and severance agreements factor into the risk balance?
Well, so one of the classic reasons you'd want to have a severance program in place, particularly a change in control severance program, is to help make sure that management stays focused on maximizing value for shareholders in a situation where they might expect that they're going to lose their job as a result of the transaction that they're entering. And the incorporation of non-compete and non-solicit arrangements in those agreements can provide additional value to shareholders in return for that security and that focus that you're getting out of providing the severance benefits.
As long as those benefits are not excessive in any way, they're really a very shareholder-friendly aspect, regardless of what the proxy advisors would tell you. Having a strong change of control program allows your company to go to market and to be acquired and for the shareholders to win within that construct. It wouldn't otherwise be there. And you look at other countries around the world that are less friendly towards some of these programs, there's a lot less merger activity in those countries. And I think the stock prices suffer in those countries, and just the overall capitalistic flow is slowed in those countries versus what we have here in the States with robust incentive plans, non-competes. Those are all good things to keep the economy flowing.
Next question. With a small cap company, it's very difficult to do a deep dive each year on overall compensation plans. What's a reasonable time frame for full review of the compensation strategy?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's an ongoing process. Now, you may not necessarily need to conduct a large, involved benchmarking study every year, particularly if you're dealing with a smaller group of executives. You may want to, test the market on a more of a deep dive every 2 years or every 3 years. But I think the whole time you're still monitoring outcomes in the plan, and you're still conducting analysis on, what the right measures ought to be in there. Really, the only thing you're missing, I think, in that case, that maybe you could let go for a year or two is doing the deep dive on what the market pay levels are. Hopefully, you won't get a red flag pop up because the market has moved and you are unaware of it. People start leaving. I mean, if you're constantly monitoring outcomes, you may be able to put that off to an every other year kind of study.
Right, and getting to one of the points you made earlier, you don't want to radically change your incentive plan every year anyway.
Right.
So while we emphasize customization and really tailoring everything to your business plan, we would hope your business plan doesn't change every year, and neither does your compensation program, frankly. So there is a cycle to changing the bonus plan every 2 or 3 years, doing gross grand changes to your LTI plan every 2 or 3 years, and that's going to work fine for you. Just making sure that you're competitive and that the pay and performance are aligned. Go ahead.
Great. It's an interesting comment and question. In technology-driven companies where innovation is critical, studies show that pay for performance reduces achievement of creative outcomes. What pay practices are the best to balance the need for great creative outcomes with the performance practices that tend to measure financial outcomes in the 1 and 2 year time frames?
I think one of the kind of more creative options out there is sort of the Netflix model, where they've de-emphasized annual incentives completely, because I think annual incentives can get in the way of things if you really don't know where you're going to go or where you're going to end up. So you pay reasonable base salaries and tack on top of that stock options or some other equity vehicle and looks farther out. So in the meantime, you've got your base salary, you go home.
A very competitive base salary.
Right.
Yeah.
You've got enough to, provide for your expenses, and that long-term care to the stock option or some other kind of stock vehicle is something you should really put on the back burner in your mind and think 5 years from now, if we get all these things put together, if we succeed, if our product wins this fight, or if somebody else comes and acquires us, frankly, we'll get paid off.
Right.
So it's those midterm, short-term bonus plans that kind of get in the way of thinking. If you're thinking about EPS, you're not going to be creative.
Right. I mean, and you can use, if you want to have a little bit more substantial sort of in between the Netflix model and the traditional going concern model, you can use, like I think we talked about one of our examples here, strategic milestones, maybe team-based goals or very individual goals in the annual plan, or simply just have a discretionary annual incentive plan. Depending on the size of your organization and the amount of trust in management's ability to really measure and reward and differentiate performance appropriately, that might be an approach that you could use as well.
Great, guys. I want to thank both David and Wes for, I think, a superb job of walking us through a very interesting, complex subject. We're about out of time, and I would like to turn the program back to Rennell Perry to wind us up.
Thank you all for your participation today. If you have any questions regarding NACD credit or the fellowship programs, please contact our fellowship program manager, Lori Whitehead, at the following information. To learn more about NACD fellowships, please visit our website, nacdonline.org/fellowships. Also, please stay abreast of upcoming NACD events and webinars. Please see our website for more information. I'd like to